Lowe's knows how to help you get the most out of your store run. That's why members save more with My Lowe's Rewards. Earn points towards My Lowe's money on eligible purchases. Get access to member-only deals and free member gifts. Plus, unlock free standard shipping when you reach Silver Key status. So what are you waiting for? Join for free today. Lowe's. We help. You save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. Now, in the last episode, we broke the immediate aftermath of the 27 dictates of the Pope, called Dictatus Papae, developed by Pope Gregory VII and Matilda of Tuscany. But before we continue that thread and its monumental aftershocks, we need to visit our Norman friends in southern Italy and Sicily. There is a lot happening down there as well, specifically in 1076, where we left off the last episode. I don't want the papal narrative to get away from us without addressing some major things happening down south that will ultimately feed into our overall narrative. So, we return to our stories of Robert Guiscard and his little brother Roger for this episode. This is episode 126, entitled, Meanwhile, in the Mezzogiorno. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. It's 1076, late spring, as Pope Gregory VII and Countess Matilda of Tuscany are readying themselves for an inevitable clash with the German king, 26-year-old Henry IV up north. We see that things in southern Italy are still a bit on the hectic side. Remember, after the failed meetings in both 1073 and 1074 between the Pope and Duke Robert Guiscard, the Pope had sought assurances from the other Norman power in the Mezzogiorno, Duke Richard of Capua and Aversa. This was certainly unsettling given the competitive history between Robert Guiscard and his brother-in-law, I should say, Richard of Capua. And though Guiscard was, without question, winning the land grab game among Norman nobles down there, Guiscard sought Richard of Capua out in 1075 in order to at least come to an understanding. It was imperative that Richard understood that in the coming actions against Salerno, that Guiscard was not making a move on Capua or Aversa next, both of them lying on the other side of Salerno and Amalfi. In fact, there was no indication at all that Guiscard wanted to defeat Richard of Capua. There was a respect between the men, though they were hardly friends, I would say. Besides, we know that Guiscard had visions that had very little to do with southern Italy anymore. Since the previous year, 1075, when he'd received the confirmation from Michael VII Ducas, Emperor of Eastern Rome, of a marriage alliance between Michael's son and Guiscard's daughter, well, Guiscard was looking east at this point. He had his sights on his progeny taking the imperial throne one day in Constantinople. And this also helps to explain a choice he made at the time, spring of 1076. See, after being excommunicated by the Pope, King Henry IV of Germany actually sent envoys and gifts to Robert Guiscard in Melfi. Yeah, it's not just the cardinals trying to undercut Pope Gregory VII right now. John Julius Norwich writes in his book Absolute Monarchs that the king, quote, formally offered him an imperial investiture of all his possessions. They may even have mentioned the possibility of a royal crown." End quote. Robert's response, however, was simple. Norwich again, quote, "God had given him his conquests. They had been won from the Greeks and the Saracens and dearly paid for in Norman blood. For what little land he possessed that had ever been imperial, he would consent to be the emperor's vassal, saving always his duty to the church, a proviso which, as he well knew, would make his allegiance valueless from Henry's point of view. The rest he would continue to hold as he had always held it, from the Almighty." End quote. Now that was a blow to Henry IV's aspirations of nailing the Pope down and marching on Rome, that's for sure. As we are well aware, Norman support is crucial at this point in the 11th century to subduing the Italian peninsula. And with Robert Guiscard's response, Henry failed to secure it. So, back to the German drawing boards. Now, as for the southern Normans, well, Guiscard immediately sent an envoy to his brother-in-law and longtime rival, Richard of Capua and Aversa, letting him know of what the German king proposed. It's full transparency at that point. He informed Richard of his denial of all of the king's offerings, but he had a larger message for the Prince of Capua. John Julius Norwich, in his book The Other Conquest, wrote, quote, "Their constant skirmishing had always been indecisive and ineffectual. It was unworthy of them both. All Normans must stand together if they were to profit by the coming crisis. Could not the two leaders now meet to discuss an end to the hostilities between them?" End quote. It was a fascinating turn of events. Guiscard, of all people, was all but pleading for Richard of Capua to meet with him, enticing his sister's husband with the instability of the situation. This is squarely in line with the way that their earlier Norman brethren secured a foothold in southern Italy decades before. The meeting actually happened. It took place. Abbot Desiderius was present, meaning it was most likely held at the Abbey of Monte Cassino in the spring of 1076. Norwich writes, quote, "The abbot was tired of seeing his monastery lands used as a perpetual battleground and had longed work for such a reconciliation." End quote. In the end, they established that no one really gained a thing over all those years, and that probably wouldn't change in the coming years. Guiscard and Richard both agreed to return any land gained over the years, which was a big one for both of these guys, most likely being more of a pride thing than anything else. And at that point, a treaty was inevitable, and one was signed by both men. Again, it was a shocking turn of events, one that no doubt flew directly in the face of what Pope Gregory VII was hoping for. He too knew that division was the key to advance against the Normans down south, and with that removed, well, a united Norman front in the south was hardly one that was going to fall easily, if at all. But Guiscard still had to do something about his terror of a brother-in-law, young Gisulf II of Salerno. So, with assurances given to Richard of Capua, Guiscard created an army of Normans, Bariats, Lombards, Greeks, Apulians, Calabrians, and Saracens. But the largest contingent of his new army were actually conscripted Amalfitans. Chronicler Geoffrey Malaterra says, quote, "He then returned to Salerno with a strong force of Amalfitans." End quote. Salerno was in for it at this point. Guiscard had his new Amalfitan navy blockade the coastal city of Salerno, and he marched his new Amalfitan army the 15 or so miles from Amalfi to Salerno. Yeah, these two hated enemies were a smidge farther than a mini marathon away from each other this whole time. Guiscard, leading his army, set up shop on the north and northeast side of the city. His original army, south of Salerno, back in Calabria, were pushing in from that direction during this time as well. Gisulf II knew his days were numbered. Very quickly, the people in Salerno were reduced to eating cats and mice, according to Malaterra's information about the siege. To boot, Abelard himself was in the city while Guiscard laid siege to it. Abelard, struck with hunger, explains Malaterra, snuck out of the city and found himself at Santa Severina on the bottom side of the boot, deep inside Calabria. Guiscard kept pressuring Gisulf in Salerno, but he sent an urgent message to his younger brother Roger in Sicily to head over and deal with Abelard there, that rebellious little nephew, which of course Roger did. Malaterra describes Guiscard's approach to his siege of Salerno as quote-unquote relentless, which is telling. The chronicler says, quote, he allowed Gisulf, who was his brother-in-law and the uncle of his children, to leave and go wherever he wished. The city, however, he retained in his power, furnishing it with citadels and defenses as he saw fit. End quote. By December of 1076, Salerno had fallen, and with the exceptions of Capua and Aversa, as well as Naples, which we haven't gotten to yet, and inexplicably the last non-Norman holdout in southern Italy, Robert Guiscard was the indisputable leader of the entire Mezzogiorno, and a growing portion of Sicily as well. Keyword growing. He had effectively defeated every Norman to test him. He had kicked out the Greeks once and for all, defeated and outwitted the papacy time and time again, denied suzerainty under a German king, secured a marriage alliance with the Byzantine emperor, and had empowered his little brother in Sicily to continue taking the island in his name. And to boot, he was currently excommunicated from the church, remember. Guiscard was now approaching 60 years old. Surely he's ready for a little rest and relaxation, right? Nope. Of course he's not. Over the next few months, Guiscard had begun weighing everything he'd accomplished. One thing he had decided on was where his capital would remain. Melfi was fine and all, but there were so many other places he'd conquered that were far better and held far more prestige than Melfi. I mean, Melfi was his older brother's capital. It was where William Ironarm first set up shop, from which Drogo sent a young Robert to Calabria on a fool's errand, and where Humphrey had launched his war against Pope Leo IX. Melfi had served its purpose over the years, and Robert felt it was time for a change. Bari was an option. It was a prominent port city with a defendable harbor, but it was directly across the sea from the Greeks, and despite his recent marriage alliance with the emperor, Guiscard learned long ago that things could change at the drop of a hat, so Bari may not be his best option for a capital. Besides, it was at the far eastern edge of his domain, a domain that now stretched, get this, 319 miles from Trapani to Bari. I mean, who puts their capital city on one edge of their nation anyway? Who's stupid enough to do such a thing? Oh. Ah, crap. I guess that's the United States. My bad. Well, anyway, it wasn't very smart 1,000 years ago, okay? Now, using the same logic, we could assume that Palermo would have been out too, though. I mean, come on. Palermo. Palermo would have made an epic capital for Robert. Sure, Messina was more central, but Sicily just wasn't secure enough yet to make it his capital. He'd worked too hard to put himself that close to real danger. Reggio was just a small port town, so Robert felt he was above such a place, but it was still very central. He could build it up, but he could do that really anywhere, I suppose. What he needed was an already established city with a more central location, maybe near a port, and maybe even something else that set it apart from all the other spots. Well, before December of 1076, he didn't really have one in all of his vast possessions that fit the description that he was looking for. But after December 1076, afterwards he did. That was the city of Salerno that he'd just taken. See, Salerno was a truly ancient city, even by 11th century standards. It had first been settled by Romans expanding their territory southward as far back as 197 BC. It's as old to Robert Guiscard in 1077 as, say, Charlemagne becoming the first Holy Roman Emperor is to us today. To give you some perspective, that is, it's around 1,200 years old. The well-worn Via Populia that connected Rome to the far reaches in Calabria was still quite active in 1077, which meant that Salerno had not only kept its prominence through the centuries, but it continued to grow and expand its prestige as well. In fact, speaking of prestige, Salerno was the home, as it still is today in fact, of a holy relic dating back to Jesus himself. One of the apostles, Matthew, well, one of his teeth were and are kept in Salerno. This greatly interested Robert Guiscard because relics, well, they were boons for business and tourism, let's be honest. Every European monarch and nobleman sought as many holy relics to fill their churches as they possibly could get their hands on. And now that Salerno was Robert Guiscard's, well, St. Matthew's tooth from the apostle himself should come with the deal, shouldn't it? Funny story. See, Gisulf II was such a turd that he actually had the tooth held in his own estate instead of in the church. Part of Robert's demands upon taking Salerno was the tooth being given directly to Robert. Gisulf obliged and gave him a tooth. But after Robert had someone familiar with the tooth check it over, verify authenticity, well, it was determined that it wasn't actually St. Matthew's tooth. Enraged, but not surprised, Robert went back to Gisulf and demanded the truth about the tooth. Turns out that Gisulf had had someone rip a tooth out of a recently deceased Jewish man, instead of just sending the saint's tooth over. In the end, according to the records, Robert Guiscard received the genuine tooth of St. Matthew, and that is how it came to remain in Salerno to this day. Yeah, who knew some guy's tooth could make it into the records that were important enough to survive almost 1,000 years later? Now 2,000 years later, I suppose. Regardless, Robert eyed Salerno with growing interest. As Norwich writes, quote, "Here was the greatest and most populous Italian city south of Rome, a proud principality for 200 years, and a seat of Europe's most renowned school of medicine." End quote. Yeah, so there's that too, the renowned school of medicine, Europe's most renowned school of medicine, Norwich says. It seems like a pretty easy decision, actually. In fact, Salerno was located on the Tyrrhenian Sea on the western coast of the Italian peninsula. It was just a quick boat ride to Messina, a short hike across the Apennines to Bari, should these needs be required. By May of 1077, Robert Guiscard officially moved his Norman capital to Salerno. In fact, he was already planning a magnificent cathedral to be erected there as a testament to its ancient prestige, as well as the bright future he hoped it would have. Salerno today still has that very same cathedral that Robert Guiscard had ordered. The Salerno Cathedral, it's called, and that's where the aforementioned tooth of St. Matthew is still kept safe. It was a new day for Robert Guiscard and his domains of Apulia, Calabria, Sicily, Amalfi, and now Salerno. However, only Calabria, Apulia, and Sicily were sanctioned possessions by the Pope. Guiscard would have to answer for Amalfi and Salerno at some point, surely. By the spring of 1077, as we will flesh out in the next 2 episodes, both Gregory and Matilda are dealing with a certain German king and his reactions to one of the most famous moments in medieval history. No spoilers right here, but suffice it to say that Gregory was in absolutely no position to deal with Robert Guiscard at this time. So, speaking of the Great Duke's land holdings, let's get back over to the island of Sicily. Let's take a few minutes and check in with Great Count Roger's progress in Sicily over the previous couple of years. Immediately following the capture of Palermo in 1072, along with the devastating death of his nephew, Serlo II, Roger was riding a wave of motivation, it seemed. Malaterra writes, quote, In every enterprise he behaved valiantly, for no pleasure could hold him back, nor make him avoid the enemy. Indeed, neither want, hard work, enemy threats, the prospect of battle at any moment, the need to be on one's guard, nor bad weather discouraged him from his tasks. The greater the difficulties which faced him, the more his resolution hardened." End quote. Now, Malaterra went on to add this, quote unquote, "He strove to conquer rather than be conquered." Now, Roger decided to take Castrogiovanni in the middle of the island, which was dangerously close to the mountaintop fortress of Enna. But what Roger set his mind to usually ended up another success for him. In 1074, so we're going to go back on our narrative just a couple years, catch us up. In 1074, he was able to secure the fortress at Castrogiovanni, and this gave him prime real estate on the island to mount offenses from a central location. It was from Castrogiovanni that Roger would, over the next decade, push westward and conquer all the way out to the western coasts of Sicily. But he was also desperate to take the western coasts because of the Zirid raids coming in increasing numbers from Africa. See, the Zirids were still a bit miffed about, once again, losing to the Normans, so they were trying everything they could to destabilize the island, and they came in the form of raiding parties from the sea. They raided all over Sicily, like all over Sicily. These pirates even raided Calabria in order to destabilize Roger's base of power and support. They continued to poke and prod the Norman count in the hopes that he would act rashly and make a mistake. But Roger was, by this time for sure, Roger was too good for such things. For 3 years, between 1072 and 1075, Zirid pirates waylaid Sicilian and Calabrian coastal cities and villages. In 1074, these Muslim pirates made it all the way through the Strait of Messina, which was controlled on both sides by Roger and his Normans, mind you. And then they sailed onto the top of the foot of Italy to a city named Nicotera. Malaterra recounts the whole horrible thing in detail. On June 29th, Muslims made landfall at night, knowing it was the Catholic holiday of St. Peter's feast the next day. The townspeople were drunk on wine and just settling in for the night, he says, and the pirates surprised everyone with a murderous rampage. So this is what he writes, quote, "They dragged women and children and everything else that could be taken away as plunder to their ships, and they burned down the entire castrum." End quote. Before sunup, the pirates were back on their ships just offshore, the town of Nicotera burning and most of its men slaughtered. On June 30th, they rowed closer to the shore and threw the boys overboard, keeping the women and girls, and they sailed away, leaving the shocked town to recover on its own. This was the threat of these Muslim raids. Though they don't get much airplay in the records, just imagine what it must have been like to be one of the residents of Nicotera or any of these other coastal cities. Malaterra picks up the story of these Zirid raids in 1075, writing, quote, "Since the previous year at Nicotera, everything had gone just as they wanted, and greed and avarice made them extraordinarily insolent. They thought in vain that things would turn out the same way. They sailed round the island and eventually landed at Mazzara." End quote. If you remember, after the capture of Palermo back in 1072, Great Count Roger had quickly assumed control over cities and areas over the northwest of the island. Not all of it, though. The very northwestern corner still held out, namely the big city of Trapani. But just south of Trapani was the port of Mazzara. Mazzara was actually pretty strategically important for Roger and his conquest of Sicily, in that it gave him eyes on the western Mediterranean directly. It also faced northern Africa, so any traffic wishing to come up around the island would have to pass by Mazzara. But here's the thing. The advantage it gave Roger also put a target on his back. As Malaterra said, the Muslim pirates in 1075 hit the shores of Mazzara. He wrote, quote, "They left their ships and making a fierce attack, broke into the city. However, there was a castle within, which they attacked bravely and laid siege to for some 8 days." End quote. Well, Roger was informed of the attack as it began, and by the time the siege was in full swing, he had secreted himself into the city and then into the castle inside. On the 8th day of the siege, Roger rallied his Norman knights, who had held out for a week already. He sallied forth from the gates and took the Muslim pirates by complete surprise. A bloodbath ensued, and very few of them, I'm gathering, made it back to their ships. Mazzara, though on the brink of being taken back by the Zirids, giving them another foothold on the island, was instead retaken by Roger. Now, after saving Mazzara, Roger was called back to Calabria to aid Robert in his dealings with Gisulf II of Salerno and his nephew Abelard, who was holed up in some castle in southern Calabria, which we've already outlined earlier. But what happened in Roger's absence is what we need to address here. In Roger's place, he appointed his son-in-law, a man named Hugh of Jarza. Jarza was a minor estate in the county of Maine back in France, and Roger had welcomed the young nobleman in his household in Sicily just a year or two earlier, marrying him to his firstborn with the beautiful Judith of Evreux, a daughter named Flandina. Hugh of Jarza was another special young knight with high aspirations and the intelligence and courage to match, possibly to the extent of Serlo II. Hugh of Jarza was immediately made the governor of Catania, the region, if you remember, just south of Mount Etna. Roger, however, gave Hugh very strict instructions while he was away. No matter what, Hugh was never to leave the comforts of the city of Catania. He was told in no uncertain terms not to pursue the enemy Saracens no matter what they tried, and they will probably try something in his absence. Though quiet for the time, Sicily was still a boiling pot ready to explode, especially since just south of Catania was the mighty port city of Syracuse, and inside Syracuse was a Saracen leader who had threatened Roger for a few years already to strike. Malaterra writes, quote, "But the mind of the young man was burning with warlike ambition, and he was anxious for praise. Ignoring the fact that this had been forbidden him, he started thinking that he might perform some noble deed to enhance his military reputation before the Count returned. So he went to Troina, and from there brought the latter's son, Jordan, along with the Count's military household, to Catania." End quote. It should be noted that Roger was no saint. He had a son illegitimately many years earlier, a boy who was raised in his father's household and trained as a knight himself. This boy's name was Jordan, and though he was his father's firstborn son, he was still considered a bastard. It wouldn't be until much later that his father was able to recognize him more formally, though. For the time being, just know that Jordan accompanied Hugh of Jarza from Troina to Catania. Now, Catania is a very hilly place with high peaks and low valleys, and the Emir of Syracuse, a man whose name was Latinized to Bernavert, was keen to take advantage of two things in the summer of 1076. These two things? The absence of Roger and that Catanian geography. Bernavert sent a contingent of 30 soldiers north to Catania to try to draw the Normans out of the city, also named Catania again. However, what he didn't know was that Hugh of Jarza and Roger's son Jordan had already been whipping up a force of their own in the hopes of marching south. Bernavert's 30 soldiers quickly drew the almost organized Norman force out of the city and through a valley where Bernavert's much larger army was waiting in ambush. It's the age-old ambush. As is customary, Hugh sent a group of around 30 knights ahead to scout the place where the larger army was to travel. Malaterra writes, quote, "The scouts out in front passed the ambush place, but when those who followed behind had reached that spot, the ambushers sprang out and charged down on their enemies like a whirlwind." End quote. Those knights out ahead looked back and saw the ambush, but knew they could never reach their comrades in time, so they bolted to Paterno to spread the news of the attack. Hugh of Jarza was killed in the action, but Jordan was able to escape back to the city of Catania. Roger, back in Calabria, heard the news, quickly wrapped up his siege of his nephew Abelard, and then returned to Sicily. He landed in Catania and immediately raised an army and marched on a Syracusan-controlled fortress town called Zotica. According to Malaterra, Roger, quote, razed it to the ground, killing the men and sending the women to be sold in Calabria. End quote. Yeek, right? In the margins of this book, I have written, Roger has a temper. But Malaterra is not done. He continued, quote, but the prince sought a fuller revenge than this, for he was extremely upset and depressed by the killing of his son-in-law, and this could be cured only by exacting full retribution. So he marched into the district of Noto, destroying everything in his path and burning all the corn, for it was harvest time and it could not be carried off. He had this done far and wide all over Sicily, and as a result, there was in this year a great shortage in the island. End quote. Roger forced a famine of sorts across the island, just like Guiscard did to Calabria all those years earlier. Malaterra added something I found quite quaint and humorous, though obviously the subject matter was far from that. He wrote, quote, so famine arises, since his revenge took away the bread. End quote. Just found that kind of quaint. Now, in this same vengeful fervor, Roger set out to establish firm control over another part of Sicily that had eluded him. Way over on the northwestern corner of Sicily was the city of Trapani, as I said, and the lands surrounding it. To its south again was Mazzara, which Roger already controlled and even defended. To its east was a wall of mountains, which Roger controlled as well. And to its northeast was the mighty jewel of Palermo, which, of course, Roger also now controlled. Trapani was the last bastion of Muslim-held territory in northwestern Sicily. As long as Roger was attacking Enna in the center, or even further south toward Agrigento and Syracuse, he would always be looking over his shoulder back toward Trapani. And besides, he was pissed. So what better time to attack someone else than when you're still wanting some revenge? Malaterra, out of absolutely nowhere, breaks out in poem at this point in his chronicles, and he all but sings the fall of Trapani, which I kind of found funny reading it. But he fleshes it out in more detail what actually happened after this. So in May 1076, Roger launches a mighty navy to round the island and land near Trapani. Roger deboards with a full contingent of cavalry and foot soldiers, while the navy sits offshore in sight of the city. The sheer size and the surprise visit force the folks of Trapani to doubt themselves in that moment, and there is hesitation within the city. Meanwhile, young Jordan, eager for his father's praise and also whipped up in a frenzy of having witnessed the death of his brother-in-law in battle weeks earlier, well, Jordan decided to grab 100 knights and sneak out behind his father's back to run a little mission of his own. See, Trapani was on the coast, but there was a peninsula that jutted way out into the Mediterranean that was largely unoccupied. It reminds me of a little bit of the geography of Bari, that peninsula that jutted out. Well, the city's vast flocks of sheep and herds of cattle were brought there each day to graze on the grasses. Everyone could see these huge numbers of animals from anywhere in and around the city. It was a pretty defining feature of the landscape. Jordan took his 100 or so men, boarded a ship, and sailed one evening over to the peninsula. He and his men landed and then found cover until morning. When dawn broke, the city woke up and began peacefully going about their business, though their weapons were nearby at all times. They, again, knew the Normans were nearby. When Jordan had seen the people all moving out into the peninsula, he sprang his trap. He captured numerous beasts and people and got them on board the ship. a ship that was simultaneously unloading loads more soldiers to join Jordan's ambush force. The people of Trapani quickly sprang to action to defend themselves. Malaterra narrates it this way, quote, "When he saw how far they had gone from the city, Jordan abandoned his prizes and charged like a savage lion at the enemy. Battle was engaged and both sides fought with the utmost ferocity. But Jordan, who was a most successful general, raised the morale of his men with rousing words of encouragement and through his bravery killed many of the enemy, put the rest to flight and emerged the victor. He pursued the fugitives, spreading death among them, right up to the city gate." End quote. Jordan did not linger outside the walls of Trapani. He gathered more of what he could out on the peninsula, and then he returned to his father. Now it seems, despite the insubordination, that great Count Roger was pleased with his son's deeds, especially since Trapani shortly afterwards sent word that they were willing to surrender. Roger was now in possession of the city of Trapani, a major holdout after the fall of Palermo 4 years earlier. But the region itself would take a few more weeks and innumerable raids to get the dozens of walled towns to surrender as well. But by the summer of 1076, Roger was effectively in control of half of Sicily. Now, with the exception of Enna, there was one more major holdout in central Sicily that Roger would need to secure before he felt comfortable enough to move further south into the island. Ultimately, the prize there being the fall of Syracuse. It was the castrum of Castro Nuovo. Castro Nuovo was ruled by a man named Abu Bekr, and according to Malaterra, quote, "He was a man of great, indeed overwhelming, arrogance. And this and his unpredictability, as well as various insults he had inflicted upon them, had rendered his subjects unfaithful." End quote. There is the story of a certain miller who he had flogged. This miller pretended to take it in stride, but held out a secret animosity toward Abu Bekr that did not go away for a very long time. Around the time Roger had taken the northwest of Sicily, in that early summer of 1076, this miller had created a small rebellion of his own outside of Castro Nuovo. The miller and his men stormed the castrum of Castro Nuovo and had taken the prominent high ground therein. The miller immediately sent word to Roger, who was relaxing in the town of Vicari, and stated that he had done this to prove his loyalty to Norman rule in Sicily. I mean, anybody would be better than this upstart Abu Bekr, right? After numerous attempts to bribe the miller and his rebels down, Abu Bekr tried forcing him out of the castrum, which also did not work. Roger quickly gathered his men again, and they quickly rode to Castro Nuovo, where he and the miller were able to smuggle some of the Norman knights into the castrum to bolster their forces. Malaterra says that when Abu Bekr saw the Normans, he lost all hope. Quote, "Indeed, in his terror, he simply abandoned it and fled away, taking with him everything which could be carried. The citizens made peace with the count and received him inside the castrum." End quote. And once again, Roger made peace with the residents and granted them many privileges. He also built up their defenses and empowered them to manage the city themselves, largely, not completely though. He then rewarded the miller with great rewards and freedoms, making him, as Malaterra says, an example for what might happen when you help the Norman count out a little. It was a bloodless conquest of a central Sicilian fortress, a fortress that was necessary, and I mean necessary, to take as he inched closer, ever closer, toward a full island-wide conquest. Now, this episode was a little reprieve from the papal politics that can get a little tedious at times, I understand. But on the next episode, we will return to the papacy and the immediate aftershocks of Gregory VII's Dictatus Papae, his 27 dictates, because that kicks off one of the most pivotal moments in all of medieval history, a moment that lives on today when it comes to the interactions between heads of states and the Pope. It will haunt the dreams of many kings to come, that's for sure. But arguably, more importantly, it will haunt the dreams of this particular pope at the center of it all for the rest of his days. And I can't wait to tell you about it.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com. This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.